I never thought I'd be the kind of person who fakes an injury just to see someone. But there I was, lying to my physiotherapist about persistent back pain that had miraculously disappeared 3 weeks ago. His name was Thaddeus, which everyone shortened to Thad, and he had these incredibly gentle hands that somehow made my entire nervous system light up like a Christmas tree every time he worked on my shoulders. I'm Marcus, by the way, and this is the story of how I became that pathetic guy who pretended to need medical treatment just to spend an hour twice a week with someone who probably thought of me as nothing more than appointment slot number 7 on Tuesday afternoons. It started legitimately enough. I'd pulled something in my lower back doing deadlifts at the gym because I was too proud to admit I needed to drop the weight. My doctor referred me to this sports medicine clinic downtown, and when I walked in for my first appointment, Thad came out to the waiting room to get me. He was wearing navy blue scrubs that somehow looked tailored, and he had this warm smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. He was maybe 30, a few years older than me, with dark hair that was just slightly too long to be professional, and these forearms that I noticed immediately because he'd rolled his sleeves up to his elbows. I'm not usually the kind of person who notices forearms, but his were distracting in a way that made me forget why I was there for a solid 10 seconds. That first session was professional and efficient. He asked questions about my pain, about my range of motion, and then had me lie face down on the treatment table while he worked on the knot in my lower back. His hands were strong and sure, and he explained everything he was doing in this calm, steady voice that made me feel like I was in incredibly capable hands. I left that appointment feeling genuinely better, with a sheet of exercises to do at home and a follow-up scheduled for the next week. I didn't think much about him that first day beyond noting that he was good at his job and easy to talk to. The second appointment was when things shifted for me. I came in still feeling pretty good, and Thad seemed pleased with my progress. We were making small talk while he worked, and I mentioned something about a documentary I'd watched over the weekend. His whole face lit up, and he said he'd seen it too, that he was kind of obsessed with documentaries about weird subcultures and niche hobbies. We spent the rest of that session talking about everything from competitive tickling to cheese rolling festivals, and I realised I was laughing more than I had in weeks. There was something about the way he engaged with conversation, like he was genuinely curious about everything, that made talking to him feel effortless. When I left that day, I caught myself thinking about him on the drive home. Nothing intense, just a pleasant awareness that I'd really enjoyed spending that hour with him. I found myself looking forward to the next appointment in a way that had nothing to do with my back. That should have been my first clue that I was in trouble, but I'm apparently very good at lying to myself. By the 4th week, my back was genuinely fine. I knew it was fine. I could do all my exercises without pain, I was back to my normal workout routine, and I had full range of motion. I should have called and cancelled my appointment, or at least told Thad that I was feeling better, and asked if I still needed to come in. Instead, I showed up, and when he asked how I was feeling, I said I was better, but still had some tightness and occasional twinges. Which wasn't technically a lie, because everyone has some tightness and occasional twinges, but it definitely wasn't the whole truth. He worked on my back anyway, and I lay there on that table feeling like the worst kind of fraud. But then he said something about how I should come back in a week just to make sure everything was stable, and I agreed way too quickly. As I was checking out at the front desk, scheduling my next appointment, I had this moment of clarity where I realised exactly what I was doing and why. I had a crush on my physiotherapist, a real honest-to-God crush that made me feel like I was 16 again, finding excuses to walk past someone's locker between classes. The thing is, I'd known I was gay since college. It wasn't some big dramatic revelation or crisis. I'd dated a few guys, had a couple of relationships that didn't work out for perfectly normal reasons, and I was generally comfortable with myself. But this felt different. This felt like something that could actually matter, which made it terrifying in a way I wasn't prepared for. I started paying attention to details I'd been unconsciously cataloguing. The way Thad's voice dropped half an octave when he was concentrating on a particularly stubborn knot in my muscles. How he always smelled like cedar, and something citrusy, subtle enough that I only noticed it when he leaned in close. The fact that he wore a small silver ring on his right thumb that he'd spin absently when he was thinking. The way he'd sometimes rest his hand on my shoulder for just a second when he was done with a session. A small gesture that felt like it contained multitudes. I tried to figure out if he might be gay too, running through every interaction for clues like I was some kind of detective. He never mentioned a girlfriend, but he also never mentioned a boyfriend. He didn't wear a wedding ring, but that didn't mean anything. He was kind and attentive with me, But that was literally his job. I was reading tea leaves and finding exactly nothing conclusive, which was probably for the best because I was already in too deep. Week 6 was when I knew I had to do something about this. My back was so obviously fine that I was running out of places to claim I had tightness or discomfort. I'd gone to see my regular doctor for a checkup on something completely unrelated, and I'd casually mentioned that I was still seeing the physiotherapist. She pulled up my chart, asked me a few questions about my current symptoms, and then very gently told me that based on what I was describing, I probably didn't need ongoing treatment anymore. She said it was great that I was being proactive about my health, but that I should be fully recovered from that initial injury by now. I thanked her and left, feeling like I'd been called out even though she had no idea what was really going on. I had an appointment with Thad the next day, and I spent the entire evening trying to figure out what to do. The rational part of my brain knew I should just cancel, or at the very least tell him I was feeling better and wouldn't need to continue treatment. The part of my brain that had apparently been taken over by my emotions insisted that I couldn't possibly stop seeing him without at least trying to figure out if there was any possibility of something more between us. I showed up the next day with no plan and way too much anxiety. Thad greeted me with his usual warm smile and asked how I'd been. I told him I was good, and then before I could stop myself, I said that my doctor had mentioned I was probably fine to stop treatment. I watched his face carefully as I said it, looking for any sign of disappointment or relief. What I saw was something more complicated, a flicker of what might have been regret followed by a professional nod. He said that was great news, that he was glad I'd recovered so well. Then he asked if I wanted to do one final session just to make sure everything was stable, and to give me some maintenance exercises I could do on my own going forward. I agreed, and he had me get on the table like always. But something felt different this time. There was a weight to the silence between us, and I swear his hands lingered a little longer than necessary when he was working on my shoulders. When the session was over, I sat up, and he was standing closer than usual. We were maybe 2 feet apart, and I could see the exact shade of his eyes, which were this complicated hazel that looked more green in the clinic's fluorescent lighting. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again. I knew this was my moment, that if I didn't say something right now, I would walk out of this clinic and never see him again, and spend the rest of my life wondering what if. So I took a breath and said, trying to keep my voice steady, that I'd really enjoyed our sessions together. Not just the treatment, but talking to him. That I'd looked forward to these appointments more than I probably should have. I was trying to be subtle about it, trying to give him an opening without being so direct that it would be awkward if he wasn't interested. Thad looked at me for a long moment, and I watched about 15 different emotions cross his face. Then he said, very quietly, that he'd enjoyed our sessions too, that he'd actually been disappointed when I said I wouldn't need to keep coming in. My heart was doing something acrobatic in my chest, and I asked, even though my voice came out slightly strangled, if that was something he was allowed to say to a patient. He laughed, and it was a little shaky. He said that technically I wasn't going to be his patient anymore after today, so he was probably in the clear ethically speaking. Then he said that he had a policy about not dating current patients, which was why he'd never said anything before, but that if I was interested, maybe we could get coffee sometime, as friends, or potentially as something else, whatever I was comfortable with. I said yes so fast that I almost interrupted him, and we both laughed, and suddenly the tension that had been building for weeks just dissolved into something lighter and more hopeful. We exchanged numbers right there, and he walked me out to the waiting room with this smile on his face that I'd never seen before, something private and pleased that made him look younger. We texted that evening, just casual conversation that felt exactly like our talks during sessions, but somehow more, because now there was intention behind it. We made plans to meet for coffee that Saturday at this place near his apartment. I spent the next 3 days oscillating between excitement and terror, changing my outfit approximately 40 times before finally settling on jeans and a dark green Henley that my sister had once told me made my eyes look good. I got to the coffee shop 10 minutes early and spent that time trying not to spiral into anxiety. When Thad walked in, he was wearing civilian clothes for the first time since I'd met him. Dark jeans and a grey button-down with the sleeves rolled up, and somehow seeing him out of context like this made him even more attractive. He spotted me and smiled, and I stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over my chair in the process. We got our drinks and sat in a corner booth, and for the first few minutes we were both a little awkward, Like we were remembering how to interact now that the structure of patient and therapist had been removed. But then he asked me about the documentary thing again, what other weird subcultures I was into, and we fell into the easy conversation that had always come naturally to us. I learned that he'd wanted to be a physical therapist since he was in high school and injured his knee playing soccer, that he had 2 younger sisters who he was incredibly close with, that he was obsessed with cooking but terrible at baking because he couldn't follow recipes exactly and kept trying to improvise, that he'd come out to his family when he was 21 and it had gone better than he'd expected, but not as well as he'd hoped, and it had taken a few years for everyone to fully adjust. I told him about my job in graphic design, about how I'd moved to the city 5 years ago for work and was still figuring out if it was where I wanted to stay long term, about my complicated relationship with the gym and how I probably needed to stop trying to prove something to myself with how much weight I could lift. Quite right, and I tried to explain that quite right, and I tried to explain that feeling of going through the motions of dating without any real spark, without feeling like I actually wanted to know everything about the other person. And then I said, before I could overthink it, that this felt different, that I'd been thinking about him constantly for weeks, that I'd been making up reasons to keep seeing him because I couldn't figure out how to turn our professional relationship into something personal. Thad got this look on his face, soft and a little amazed, and he admitted that he'd been doing the same thing in his head, that he'd been extending my sessions slightly, finding excuses to spend a few extra minutes with me, that he'd been hoping I'd say something but couldn't say anything himself because of the ethical implications, that when I'd told him my doctor said I was fine, his first thought hadn't been professional pride in my recovery, but genuine sadness that he wouldn't have a reason to see me anymore. We sat there in that coffee shop for 4 hours, until the baristas started giving us pointed looks about closing time. When we finally left, it was dark outside and the air had that cool bite that meant fall was really settling in. We stood on the sidewalk, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye, and Thad asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime that week. A real date, he clarified, not just coffee as friends. I said yes, and he stepped closer, and for a second I thought he might kiss me right there on the street. Instead, he reached out and squeezed my hand once, brief but deliberate, and the contact sent electricity up my arm. He said he'd text me, and I watched him walk away until he turned the corner, and then I stood there for another minute just grinning like an idiot at nothing. Our first real date was at this small Italian place that Thad loved, tucked away in a neighbourhood I'd never explored. We shared a bottle of wine and split 3 different pasta dishes because we couldn't decide what to order, and he told me about the worst cooking disaster he'd ever had, which involved a kitchen fire and an attempted soufflé. I told him about the time I'd accidentally sent a client presentation that was full of placeholder text that said things like, "Insert inspirational bullshit here," and we laughed until we were both crying. After dinner, we walked around the neighbourhood, and somehow my hand found his, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We ended up at this small park with a view of the city skyline, sitting on a bench, and that's when he finally kissed me. It was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement, and I answered by pulling him closer. When we broke apart, he was smiling against my mouth, and he said he'd been wanting to do that since approximately our 3rd appointment together. That was 4 months ago. Now Thad is sitting on my couch with his feet in my lap, reading a book while I'm supposed to be working on a design project, but I'm instead watching him and feeling this overwhelming sense of gratitude that I was stupid enough to fake back pain for weeks. We haven't told anyone the full story of how we met yet because it's objectively ridiculous and slightly embarrassing, but it's ours, and I love it. My back, for the record, is completely fine, but Thad still gives me massages sometimes when I've had a long day at work, and I give him terrible cooking lessons where I mostly just watch him work and steal tastes of whatever he's making. We've fallen into this easy rhythm where everything feels both exciting and comfortable. New, but also like it's always been this way. I'm pretty sure I'm falling in love with him, if I haven't already completely fallen, and the scary part is that I think he might be falling too. Last week he introduced me to his sisters, and they immediately started telling me embarrassing stories about him from childhood while he pretended to be mortified, but was actually loving it. I met his eyes across the table at one point, and he smiled at me with this expression that was so openly affectionate, it made my chest ache in the best way. I never thought I'd be grateful for a gym injury, but here we are. Sometimes the best things come from the most unlikely places, from faking symptoms and taking chances and being brave enough to say what you really want. My doctor was right that my back was fine, but she had no idea that those appointments were fixing something else entirely, something I hadn't even known was broken until Thad's careful hand started putting it back together.